recommend using a recent version of the desktop Zoom client and minimizing all other windows. If you're viewing this presentation in a group setting, group attendance sheets are available at forvismazars.us. Finally, if all eligibility requirements are met, the compliance team will send your CPE certificate within 2 weeks via email. And with that, I'll hand it over to our two presenters, Christy Clements and Alan Blum, who both sit in our New York offices.
Thank you, Aaron. One little correction. I'm in the New York office. Christy, you are in the Indiana office, I believe?
Indianapolis,
Indianapolis.
Yes.
So thank you for introducing us. We do appreciate it. I am the New York Metro Area Healthcare Leader. I'm an audit partner primarily with regard to the services that I do provide. Christy is an internal audit managing director here within the firm. She does an amazing job with regard to the projects that she does work on. And very happy for everybody to be here today as part of our fall series for Tuesdays at 10. We've been doing these for about 3 years now. A little bit of a different topic that we want to introduce for today's session, risk management for IDD and BH providers, and in general, the healthcare industry itself. The risk management process is extremely important with regard to your organization due to the many moving parts and compliance requirements and everything else that we do have to worry about on a day-to-day basis. I've had the pleasure of working with Christy now for a number of years on a couple of different projects that her and I have been working on. She is really amazing at her trade and very, very happy to have her here today to really do the heavy lifting for today's session. I'll chime in a little bit, but really Christy will take us through most of the risk management and I'll come back on more towards the end. So if I can turn it over to Christy, welcome.
Thank you, Alan. All right, well, let's take a moment first to review the agenda and see what we'll be covering today. First, we'll begin by exploring and understanding risk, and then we're going to look at why risk management is important in the space for the population you serve, for safeguarding organizational reputation, ensuring ongoing compliance with complex regulations. We're all familiar with that. Risk management is really the cornerstone to sustainable care delivery. And so then we'll focus on assessing risk and how do we do that and how do we score risk? And that's really the core to risk management. In today's presentation, we'll talk about how to systematically identify, analyze, and prioritize those risks, making sure it's tailored specific to your organization. It is not a one-size-fits-all, and it will be it should be customized to your organization, your organization's risk appetite, and their tolerance for risk. We'll also explore how through a risk assessment that can guide you for decision making and what action you will take, and whether it's a process to be used for risk tracking or risk categorization, or the strategies for engaging your teams to manage and address risk. We'll leave you with examples and methods that you can implement in your organization. And I think it's also important that in today's session, I hope that you'll feel comfortable and confident afterwards that you can get started with building out a risk management program. I always say start by keeping it simple. You'll hear me say that several times, but it'll help you manage and improve your organizational strategy and the outcomes. So next slide, please. Risk is everywhere and it's always present, and risk is unavoidable. It's a reality whether we like it or not. It's a reality whether you're dealing with clinical operations, regulatory compliance, financial management risk. They're constantly present. And so acknowledging that helps us prepare for how we address them proactively, which is the goal, to be proactive and strategic and informed versus reactive. If you're operating in an environment where it feels like you're always putting out fires or you're always reacting to surprises, then this might be a good indicator that implementing or starting off a risk management program, it may be time for that. It's important to understand that risk is embedded in every industry, every organization, every process, and it's in every decision we make. Every action or decision, whether large or small, carries some level of risk, from how we deliver care to how we manage our resources to every aspect of operations. they all have an inherent risk associated with them that must be considered. The other thing that needs to be understood and acknowledged is that risk is dynamic. It's never static. It's always changing. The landscape of risk is always evolving. Just think about it. New technologies, new regulations, societal shifts, all of these can create emerging risks that maybe aren't on our radar a year ago, or maybe even a month ago, or even a week ago. So recognizing that risk is always present and always changing, it informs us that we need to stay nimble and agile in response to risk and really adjust our risk management strategies as necessary. Have to stay vigilant. Some risks are higher than others, and that means we need to continually assess and reassess them to stay ahead of them. That's that proactive operating mode versus reactive. But most importantly, I mean, risk isn't confined to the business environment. It's something we deal with in life every day. Sometimes we become overwhelmed with the thought of a risk management program. It's one more thing on our task list to do, but we're already practicing it every day, even in our personal life. First thing I do every morning is check the forecast. Do I need an umbrella? So risk management, we're doing it without even realizing we're doing it. So I'm managing risk, whether at an organizational level or in our personal life, equips us to make informed decisions, mitigate any potential risk, and ultimately the goal is to thrive in our environments, both in our organization and personally. Okay, so on the next slide, defining risk. Risk is defined several ways, but at its core, it really involves and evolves around the potential for a negative consequence. That could be large or small. And that's where we get into risk scoring, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But risk is about exposure to a negative event, the possibility that something unexpected or undesirable could happen. And this can lead to the possibility of loss, whether it's financial, operational, reputational. A key component of risk is the uncertainty regarding an outcome. We don't know if or when something might go wrong, but the potential is always there. And then finally, I guess, risk also involves vulnerability to failure, loss, or rejection. That's how some people define it. So whether it's a treatment plan or a business initiative, vulnerability exposes us to the chance that things may not go as planned, and it may have an impact on our organization. So understanding these facets helps us recognize and prepare for the inherent uncertainties associated with risk. So risk avoidance. Some of us are just more adverse than others. When we talk about what keeps us from taking risk, there are several factors that come into play, leading to risk avoidance. First, there's just strategic uncertainty. This can make organizations hesitant if you don't understand or there are unknown outcomes for decisions. It creates anxiety about potential failure. Organizations sometimes are just inherently or culturally risk adverse, but there's also tension between stability versus innovation. Look, if it's not broke, don't fix it. Let's keep the status quo, and that may be okay, but risk management program will help you make a determination if you stay the same, stay the course, or do you take that chance? Because sometimes with every chance there's risk, and sometimes that chance can lead to good things. While innovation is critical for growth, the need to maintain stability can hold us back from those bold moves I was talking about. A common barrier is always the fear of failure, where potential for things goes wrong discourages action. There's stakeholder pressures that adds a whole nother layer of balancing expectations and concerns, whether it's funders, boards, clients, or regulatory concerns. And then, like most organizations, we have limited resources, right? Which continues to constrain our ability to make risk, since stretching thin can jeopardize our operations. Do we take on risk that will only continue to strain those resources more? Then there's disruption. Both internal and external factors can happen. The market, cyber attacks, those types of things, the political landscape, all of those have an impact too, potentially. Past failures or successes can also shape the culture of the organization, making them risk adverse. And sometimes risks are avoided rather than embraced. And even when the potential rewards are high, organizations may determine it's not worth it. So when risks present and become a reality, next slide, please, the consequences can be significant, which is why it's so important to focus on managing them effectively. First, there's brand reputation and the ability to execute. Those are often the most visible casualties when risks present themselves or materialize. Boeing and their quality issues come to mind here for me. And anytime I hear their name, that's the first thing I think of anymore. So, their lack of focus, perhaps on quality, has now impacted their reputation. A failure to manage those risks can damage the organization's credibility and trust, making it harder to attract new clients, customers, or partners. The second key area impacted is those relationships and services. When risks aren't properly mitigated, it can strain relationships with key stakeholders that may be necessary, whether they're clients, families, regulatory bodies, community partners. All of these key stakeholders play a role in the success of our organization. So disruptions can lead to reduced service levels, delayed care, or even harm to those that we serve. So it's especially critical on any lapse of mitigating risk or monitoring risk. It can really impact the well-being of the vulnerable individuals that we serve. And by caring about these risks and managing them proactively, we can protect not just our organization, but the people we serve. So on the next slide, we often think of risk in negative terms, but it's important to recognize that not all risk is bad. In fact, taking calculated risk is essential for growth, innovation, and improvements. And without some level of risk, organizations can become stagnant, missing out on opportunities to advance, evolve, or better support their mission. And I think this is the biggest takeaway. One of the biggest takeaways is that we often think of risk in negative terms, but if you can embrace it and you have a methodology to inform yourself about it and measure it, you can make those informed decisions and be able to feel comfortable taking on some risk. When we approach.
So very interesting, Christy. Sorry to interrupt. As you talked about before, so many risks that might impact our industry, but if you don't take risks, then you're not going to get anywhere at the end of the day. The question is which risks are bad, which risks are not bad, and how do we control those risks at the end of the day? I remember a number of years ago sitting in a audit committee meeting, ready to present financial statements, and the audit committee chair and I were having a conversation about reputational risk and how that potentially might impact you as an organization, and what those risks are, and what are the most important things that you should really be thinking about at the end of the day. So yes, not all risks are bad, and we do have to take that little bit of a step forward. Otherwise, we're going to stagnate and, in effect, not have an operation anymore as we do move forward. So thank you.
Absolutely. We have to think and approach risk strategically, and without a thorough assessment or mitigation plans in place, risk needs to be thought of as an opportunity rather than a threat. So having that alternative view of risk allows us to see it not as something to be feared, but a potential driver for progress. All right, our next slide is a polling question. So polling question number 1, all risk is bad and should be avoided at all costs. A, true, B, false, C, you're not sure, or D, none of the above. I'll give you a minute or so to respond.
And as we know, some risks are unavoidable. And we do need to handle those and make sure that we do have the program appropriately to get there.
That's right. All right. So, exactly. False would be the answer there. Again, think of risk as an opportunity rather than a threat. All right. So as we move forward, again, I want to shift our focus to the idea that not being willing to take risk or being overly risk adverse, we sometimes may miss out on the greatest opportunities for success or growth. Historically, we've had thought leaders, you'll see on the slide, across various fields. They've consistently shown us that risk often the gateway to innovation, progress, and achievement. So from sports legends to business icons, and yes, even political figures, there's a common thread in their success. They didn't shy away from risk. They took calculated risk. And you'll see in these quotes, they illustrate how embracing risk rather than avoiding it has been key to them achieving greatness. So to navigate risk effectively on the next slide, organizations will need to shift from simply reacting to risk to operating in what we call a risk intelligent mode. And that's, again, being informed. So where decision making is informed, it's strategic, it's proactive. This requires in organizations a cultural shift towards a mindset of risk management, where the focus is on identifying, managing risk before they materialize, embedding it in your day-to-day operations, where through discussions when you're trying to determine or make a decision or determine next steps, you have the ability in the conversation and an awareness to discuss the risk associated with it. That's when you're at a mature risk culture where you're discussing risk and thinking about risk in decisions that you make, large and small. And by doing so, you achieve several key benefits: business resilience in the face of challenge, resource optimization by directing efforts where they're needed most, and enhanced compliance with regulatory standards. There are other benefits. Effective risk management protects your reputation, increases efficiencies operationally. A lot of times I'm asked, we just don't have the resources to implement a risk management program. But you would find that there are efficiencies to be gained. And it even supports innovation by providing that stable foundation for growth. So on the next slide, effective risk management is really built upon some key principles, and we're going to walk through each one of them. Balance is being the key to navigating risk successfully. And again, start small. If you're just getting started, do not overwhelm yourself. Do not make it overly complex. I will give you some very simple, basic, but effective examples of how to get started. First, you need to identify your risks. And this means understanding where potential threats or even opportunities lie within your organization. And so this can be through brainstorming, identifying what objectives you have. But once they're identified, the assessment of risks is the second principle. It's crucial to evaluating both the likelihood and the impact of the risk on your organization. And from there, it goes to determining the response to these risks. Once you've scored them, we'll talk about that in a little bit, and how you respond to risk. We'll cover the 4 responses to risk. And then it's monitoring and reviewing of risk on an ongoing basis. It's not a one and done process. So a risk management program, you don't stand it up once, go through the whole process and all of the principles, and then file it away. It needs to be embedded in your organization, and it needs to be a continual process. Communication and reporting are vital, ensuring all stakeholders are on the same page, speaking the same language, they're aligned in the risk management. So it has to be integrated in the culture, and that environment where informed risk taking is encouraged and managed ultimately drives better outcomes. Okay, so we're going to first start with identifying our risks. and discuss that process for creating what we call a risk universe. And so creating a comprehensive risk universe involves really a structured process. Now, don't be afraid when I say structured, it's just a methodology that begins with a deep understanding of your organization's mission and objectives. And that's important because those are defining the core goals that your organization is trying to achieve. And that helps us identify the risks that may keep you from achieving your mission, those goals, those key objectives. So it's essential to review and understand also any regulatory and compliance requirements that are specific to you. What are the risks there for non-compliance? And from there, we map out and we start inventorying all our key operational areas to identify what their objectives are. They have day-to-day objectives as well. And so following that, we identify core services that each of those business areas are responsible for, any programs, as they may represent the primary offerings that must be safeguarded against potential risks. And then we have to consider stakeholder expectations. So these are little building blocks that we're following, and we're gathering all of this information so we become informed. And look, there is no right or wrong to this, and there is no perfection. This is a evolving, iterative process. So just getting started, as I said, start small. But you have to consider your stakeholder expectations and needs. And your stakeholders are internal and external. What are the risks that they present to your organization, and defining those? And unmet expectations of some of your stakeholders can pose significant risk. And that's why it's really critical that they are included and given consideration. It's also important to conduct an inventory of external environmental factors that you may have absolutely no ability or limited ability to affect, but it could impact your organization. So it's having those on your radar and having a plan of action related to those risks. And then you're going to evaluate existing processes and systems to identify risks. So, for example, if you think of systems from an IT perspective, you may have older systems that are no longer supported, or perhaps you are ready to implement a new system. Both of those have risks. A lot of times I'll see organizations where they're like, we're not making any significant IT changes or changes to our systems. That in itself can be a higher risk sometimes than moving on to a new system. So that has to be considered as well. And then it's also useful, I think, to engage cross-functional teams, involve other members of the organization in this process of building out your risk universe, because they can provide diverse perspectives and insights. It's also considered a best practice to leverage any past audit, corrective action plans, or incident reports so that you have a historical context. You can identify trends that may have gone undetected before until you started looking at it through the lens of risk. And finally, don't be afraid to consult external experts. Mixing in the specialized knowledge can enhance your understanding and provide really a full risk landscape, because they'll bring a unique and different lens as well. So identifying and creating your risk universe is not unique to one sector, as I said. This is what I was talking about when I said this really is applicable to all industries and organizations.
So as you're going through this process with regard to the identification, one little additional item that we have to worry about here in New York State, under the regulatory and compliance requirements, we all know that we have the Office of Medicaid Inspector General running around. And for the first time, I believe in a number of years, they actually did publish a audit plan for the 24 year, I think for 25 potentially also. Very extensive with regard to what they're looking at and the different types of organizations and the programs that they're working on. And for instance, we've heard very recently they're auditing the healthcare worker bonuses that were given out by the state through the organizations. They're auditing the wage stabilization initiative funds. So all good things come with regulatory compliance at the end of the day. So we do have to make sure that that's also included as part of our risk management process, in addition to all these other items that Christy has been laying out. I think we have a polling question next.
Yeah.
The right spot. Here we go.
So when implementing a risk management program, you should limit your approach, start small, have a holistic approach, start out large, only include a small team at one level of the organization, or only involve the executives. What is a best practice?
Just the old story. Don't bite off too much of the apple that you can't chew, right?
That's right. That's right. Keep it simple.
Yeah.
I
We've got a
think
lot
I
of
gave
organizations.
away the answer.
No, we have organizations start these up, and it's a very important approach with regard to getting your feet wet, understanding it, because it is a very comprehensive system.
Yes.
So 52%, limited
Yes.
approach, but not small.
Yes. Yes. So, all right. On the next slide, we're going to start building out a tool. So we have our risk universe. So this is really, this graphic shows you an example of a risk universe. And this is maybe what you would see as you're just starting out. You'll see several high-level categories that help define major areas of risk that can occur. So strategic, operations, legal and compliance, financial reporting, reputation, IT. Each of these categories encompasses sub-processes, which you'll see on the graphic, that really help pinpoint more specific risk and functions. It's more granular. So for example, under the strategic category, risk can include market shifts, things outside of our control, but how do we respond to them? Mergers, those types of things. Operations, for example, can include service delivery, client safety, physical security, those just to name a few. So again, keeping it simple, I would say under each of these categories, just to get started, probably not have more than 5 or 6 under each one as you get started with your risk management implementation. It's important to remember, again, that your risk universe is not one and done. And as your organization continues to evolve, you will continue to build out these risk management processes, your risk universe, the sub-processes to get more granular and expand your risk management program. Periodically reassessing and reevaluating these categories and the sub-processes is necessary, helps you make sure you're staying ahead of the emerging risk. So continuing to build it out as you mature your program and use really an evolving approach. So on the next slide, you're going to see an example from a risk universe from a healthcare provider that has been doing this for several years. And they call their risk universe a risk map, and their sub-processes they refer to as auditable units. But really, I just wanted to share this as a demonstration of what another, risk universe could look like, one that is mature and comprehensive, so you can begin with kind of the end in mind and what a risk map could look like. What's important to note here is that the organization has continually built out its risk map and its sub-processes over time. And as risk management programs mature, they were able to go into each area at a more granular state, into each risk category, identifying specific areas that could be monitored. This organization has an internal audit function, so that's why they refer to it as auditable units. Those sub-processes are areas or processes that could be audited. So this example just shows you that you can expand out your risk universe as you identify more risks and break down those processes into smaller, more manageable units. But again, start at a higher level.
And as providers of IDD and behavioral health services, it's very interesting because we really don't think of ourselves as healthcare providers, but we really are managing our consumers' needs and making sure we are attentive to their needs, for everyday life. And while this might be more of a more of a healthcare system type of a chart, it gives you a really good layout of what to start thinking about with regard to each of the initiatives and the different areas that they do have. And when you start looking at some of the specifics, whether it be a patient flow strategy, change that to be a consumer flow strategy, with regard to where the consumers are and how we're handling them at the end of the day. Up in the right in the middle, the governance area, board structure and operation, very important area that potentially even to start at, looking at what's happening within each of those particular areas. So this is really, really helpful, at least to me, with regard to getting into and understanding organizations and working to identify what each of these particular areas are and what those auditable units or potentially might be. And yes, you don't need a full internal audit program to do all of this. You can start very, very slow, as Christy was saying before, because you can you do it yourself. You can hire an outsider to come in, do one project or two projects, and start taking a look at what's happening on the internal workings of the organization.
That's exactly correct. So feel free to use this slide as you start considering your sub-processes. Okay, on the next slide. So now we have our risk universe identified, and the next step is really to focus on identification of specific risk within each category. And to do this, you're going to conduct really a risk assessment for each category and sub-process. And risk assessment and conducting a risk assessment may sound overwhelming. You may feel like you don't have the skill set to do it, but believe me, you do. And everyone does it, as I said, every day in their personal life and their professional life, and we're assessing risk all the time. And so we all have the skill set. So you first start by engaging a multidisciplinary team. So bringing all the people together from different areas, those sub-processes, owners of those sub-processes, or someone who's very knowledgeable from each of those sub-processes within the organization to ensure you're capturing a wide range of perspective. And oftentimes, this is done through brainstorming sessions where you're whiteboarding, okay, what are your objectives? What are the risks that will keep you from meeting those objectives? And this is where we start getting more granular. We're moving down a little bit. It can also be surveys, but to be honest, to get started, I have found those brainstorming and whiteboarding sessions to be more useful and effective than surveys, but it also is an opportunity to start building that risk culture where you're having those discussions. And it becomes just part of the taxonomy of the organization and discussing those risks. So from there, you'll need each of those sub-processes to identify their objectives on a daily basis for each of the sub-processes. So you know what they're assessing and why. In other words, what are their key objectives that they're trying to meet daily in those sub-processes? Perhaps under financial reporting, the objective would be timely budgeting and forecasting. Or under operational, it could be revenue collection. It's ensuring that you have accurate and complete charge capture, for example. So identifying those objectives under each sub-process. And I would start with just two or three. What are the two or three largest objectives you are trying to accomplish with each sub-process? A crucial part of this process is also to review those reports and other information. So you're gathering information from these discussions. You're also reviewing reports and other information as well. Incident reporting will allow you to inform yourself on past or historical incidents. It may highlight recurring risks and areas that may need additional attention. So you marry all of that with your whiteboarding sessions, regulatory compliance, Speak to your general counsel or your legal team about any obligations that you have as an organization, but how do they apply to each of those sub-processes? There's probably something there for every single one of them. And so additionally, you'll want to review the historical management reports, environmental safety, patient outcomes, those types of things. So the final deliverable of all of this is going to be a risk register, which really documents, it's a single document, can be created in Excel to really identify and inventory all of your risks and all the information related to each of those risks. So on the next slide, you'll see that we start out with our risk register. And this is the Excel spreadsheet I was talking about. And so I really want to just emphasize, again, keep it simple. There's not a lot of columns here. Your risk register doesn't need to be overly complex to be effective. In fact, it's better if it's not. At its core, it should document the basics, starting with a risk ID that you assign. And, however you want to index it, I've seen it done a number of ways. There's no right way or wrong way. It can include a prefix that relates to a category, like financial could have FIN and then a number, or it can just be a numbering scheme. So again, it's up to you and how you want to do it, but it is then followed by a clear risk description. What could go wrong? That really outlines the nature of the risk and a description of it so that someone can pick it up and read it and understand what the impact could be. Next, you'll want to categorize the risk by aligning it to the relevant risk category that we had in our risk universe. And that goes back to that previous slide. So strategic, operational, financial. Another essential component is scoring the risk, which will help you determine where to focus your resources to address that risk. But we'll cover that in a minute. And finally, it's really crucial to assign a risk owner. Who's going to own this risk? Who is going to be responsible for monitoring it, understanding it, just owning it, and managing it? So keeping the risk register straightforward and easy to use ensures that it remains an effective tool for everyone across the organization to be able to understand and use without it becoming overwhelming. So on the next slide, we're really going to start talking about risk and risk scoring. So you'll see an example here. We have 5 risks, and it's important to note before we get started that there are many methods for assessing risks. It's not a one-size-fits-all. It's also not an exact science. There's a lot of professional judgment that can be applied and should be applied. The key really is to choose a method that works best for your organization and is easy to apply consistently, and it's easy to explain to others who may be participating in the exercise. Keep in mind that this exercise includes everyone from executives to line level leaders, and so you want it to be easy to understand but yet comprehensive for your needs. So in this example, we're using a 1 to 5 scale. We see this most often. This is where we're going to start assessing and assigning scoring to the likelihood of occurrence and the potential impact of each risk. So for likelihood, a score of 1 represents, you'll see the scoring boxes in the lower left-hand corner. 1 represents it's a rare event, while 5 indicates it's most certainly going to happen. So it could be a new regulation or a new law. The likelihood of it occurring, we know it's going to occur. So it may warrant a 5. When we talk about potential impact, we use the same scale, 1 to 5, but in this instance, 1 represents that the impact would be insignificant, where 5 would represent that it could be catastrophic to the organization. So by using simple and intuitive scale like this, we can make risk assessment, and we just did. We just went through and figured out how we're going to assess these risks more accessible and consistent across the organization for everyone. The key takeaway here is just keeping it straightforward. Don't make it overly complex. I have seen in more mature risk management programs where they may weight certain categories. They assign weighting to that. And that's fine. Maybe you assign, compliance as one of your heaviest most weighted items. But that's just one more facet that you can add to it, to your risk management program. But again, I think it's just as effective to keep it simple. Now that we've covered how to use the 1 to 5 scale, the next step is really applying the scoring to the columns labeled likelihood and occurrence and potential impact. The scoring is done judgmentally, meaning you'll use your knowledge, your experience, and the available data that you've gathered to determine where each risk falls on the scale. So, for example, if a risk is unlikely to happen and would have no significant impact if it did, you might score it a 2 for likelihood and a 4 for impact. But anyway, that will allow you to systematically evaluate and compare risks. So you'll see in this matrix, we have our 5 example risks that we were talking about, and we now have assigned it and scored a score in the likelihood of occurrence and the potential impact. But now we have to assign a severity rating. And how do we do this? Well, it's really easy. You multiply your impact and likelihood scores together, and that is your severity rating. You'll see at the bottom, there is, again, a matrix that will help you determine red, yellow, or orange. So a score from 15 to 20 could be considered high risk, highlighted in red, 8 to 14, a medium risk, highlighted in orange, and then 1 to 7 would be low. We have it yellow here. Sometimes I see it as green, but this color-coded system makes it easy to quickly identify which risk should be prioritized. And so on the next slide, so as I mentioned, risk scoring and risk assessment, not a perfect science. So when we talk about risk prioritization, it's important to focus on the mitigation factors that are currently in place. And that's how you come up with your scoring. So there's inherent risk, meaning if no controls were in place, how would you view this risk? If you have controls, which I'm sure you do, like policies and procedures and reviews and those types of things, you give consideration to that in your scoring, and then you're looking at residual risk, which residual risk refers to the level of risk that remains after you have mitigation strategies put in place, like controls. On the next slide, so once you've measured and scored your risk, it's determined how you respond to them. There are 4 responses to risk. The first response is that you're just going to accept it. It's a risk. It's typically, if you accept the risk, it tends to be a lower risk. It happens when the risk is low or the cost for mitigation outweighs the benefits. So essentially, you acknowledge the risk, but you've decided that you're going to proceed without any significant intervention. The second response to risk is mitigating the risk. So that means we understand the risk is there, we acknowledge it, we're going to implement some additional controls, some additional reviews, and then we'll measure how effective we are at managing that risk. The third option is to transfer the risk, and this is done through insurance, outsourcing, contractual terms that you may add to your contracts. It doesn't eliminate the risk, but it shifts the financial burden or the potential impact or a portion of it to someone else. And the fourth risk is just to avoid it. And again, that's the most drastic option. You may determine that it just carries too much risk. And that could be looking at a merger and then deciding, nope, we don't want to do it, or a new system, nope, we're not ready for it. That's really going to be determined by your appetite for risk as an organization. Each response has its place, and your approach should align with your organization's overall risk appetite. And then you'll see we established a plan for those that we want to mitigate. We document the plan, even the transfer, and then as well expected implementation dates.
So Chris, So
Yes.
Christy, when you're going through this and you're determining your implementation target dates, what are you thinking about with regard to setting that time frame?
So they can be thought of in a number of ways. Sometimes we triage them into quick fixes, moderate fixes, or long-term fixes. If a fix is, for example, implementation of a new system, that's going to be a longer term fix because there's a long investment. And so what you can have are milestone dates. They can have multiple dates associated with them in that instance. So some of these may be really quick to implement. And so the key is to be flexible. And if you do change your dates, you can track that in your sheet, and you probably should, with a rationale behind why the date was moved or changed. Maybe the risk was no longer is a risk, and so at that point it may change to a lower, may change from red to orange or orange to yellow. So that's where the monitoring and review phase is critical.
Thank you.
Okay, so monitoring and review, as I said, adjustments are to be made proactively. You need to make sure that you are monitoring and reviewing the effectiveness of your risk response. And so now I think we have another polling question, and I will turn it over to Alan.
Thank you. So the third polling question is monitoring risk response results is not necessary, true or false? As Christy went through the last number of slides, certainly as we're seeing it, we've kind of given you the answer already. It's kind of pretty straightforward. But the risk management process, as we're going through and talking about with regard to the effectiveness of the risk process and making sure that we do have the right tracking at the end of the day, I really like your chart with regard to the multiplication and determining what those high risk areas are, so that the organization can focus in on what's much more important at the very beginning. Hopefully, over the period of time, you do get all the areas covered. So 95% false certainly is the correct answer at the end of the day. Now, with regard to the balance of our session, so Christy, thank you for all the information that we've gotten so far. We really need to now talk a little bit about the communication reporting and a couple of other areas with regard to what we are going forward with. So clear and concise reporting in terms of communication is going to be extremely important. We want to make sure everybody understands and we're very transparent with regard to the entire process. We want buy-in. We want everybody on board with regard to the process so that we can really be effective with regard to our risk management program. Frequency of reporting really will determine on the resources that you do have. But certainly I would want to make sure that we have at least a quarterly type of a get together, some type of meeting to make sure that we are moving this forward. Probably the stakeholders involved in the individual areas are meeting on a much more often basis to make sure that they can report, because as we know in everything that we do, it's a process building up towards that quarterly reporting to whoever is the overall owner. And to me, that would be those charged with governance or the board at the end of the day, working with management to make sure that this is really all where it should be. Tailor the communication so that they are readable and understandable with regard to what we're doing, and making sure that the reader of it can understand where we're going, what it means at the end of the day, and what we really need to do as we do go forward. As we said, should be a regular cadence with regard to communication and reporting with regard to the program itself. Talked about transparency, open communication. Christy talked and I like the spreadsheets that we talked about here before. Visuals, I find, really move the whole process forward. I did sit on a board for many, many, many years, and a lot of different constituents who do sit on the board for a lot of different reasons. And you have some lawyers, you have accountants, you have non-technical people, but everybody's important with regard to the entire process. And some people really understand a lot better through visuals and metrics. And you know what? Risk assessment and risk management is not an easy area to really focus in upon, and that will really help us as we do move forward to understand what we're trying to achieve at the end of the day. Data-driven insights with regard to the information that we are looking at. Data is so important. It is everything that we touch all day long. One of my staff and I talked in a data conference a couple of weeks ago, and a whole 2 days worth of sessions were about data, how it would impact the overall organization at the end of the day, and of course, very feedback loops. Everything, of course, being timely, relevant, and actionable at the end of the day. So making sure we do have those stakeholders involved with regard to the entire process. Integration within the organization, we must make sure that risk management is shown as a core value. As with everything else, if we don't have the appropriate tone at the top, it's going to fail. We want to make sure that those in the C-suite, those who are the managers of the organization, really buy into this process because it will help us. As Christy said before, risk is unavoidable at the end of the day. We do have to deal with it on a regular, ongoing basis. And when the top of the organization is showing that we are out there, we're really hitting it head on to make sure that we do understand what's going on with regard to risk and how it might impact us, it will help everybody else really get involved. Getting the employees involved, as we said before, extremely important. They are the key to this really moving forward, because when you're in those smaller groups and in those work areas, we're working with the line employees within the organization, and we want to make sure we get the appropriate information, assigning clear roles and responsibilities throughout the process will be extremely important. Want to make sure we have an owner, as Christy indicated before on her charts, but we want to make sure that the underlying roles and the responsibilities are fully assigned so everybody knows what they need to do to get to the finish line within each quarter or whatever reporting cycle that we are working under. As we talked a little bit before, tailoring communications across the organization, it might be a little bit different. Those that we send to the board versus those that we send to the employees, and we want to make sure that it's fully understandable and everybody, again, has that full overall buy-in with regard to what we have. And eventually, as your program matures a little bit, we want to integrate it into our day-to-day decision making so that we really can move the organization in the right direction as to where we're going forward to. As we talk about within our firm, the pace of change today is the slowest that it will ever be. So when we're dealing with everything within the organization, we have to really focus in upon it and move this forward as quickly as we can so that you can integrate the risk management system and reduce the risks as you do go forward. Ongoing education and awareness and fostering a proactive risk culture within the organization will help this. Risk management really, as we talked about, should really be integrated to every level of the organization, from the top of the organization to the frontline staff and everybody who is working with your consumers on a day-to-day basis. Building that strong risk culture, as we talked about, the leadership commitment, the tone at the top at the end of the day, with regard to making sure the program will be focused and that it will be achievable with regard to what we do have. Embed the risk accountability across the entire organization because every area something can happen, and we want to make sure we are dealing with that on a regular basis. Open and transparent communication, as we said, the regular trainings and awareness, the decision making, clear risk reporting channels. So people really need to know who they should go to, who that risk should be reported to, and we want to make sure that we are dealing with those things that are cropping up on a regular basis with regard to the operations of the organization, and reinforce a culture of continuous improvement with regard to everything that we do. So lastly, with regard to the risk management area, we want to plan, we want to do, we want to check, we want to act, everything that's going on within the organization. We really pushed very hard to make sure that if you don't think about these things, it could affect you really, really bad. Training, staff development, data-driven risk management, collaboration and communication, and just to think about what's happening in the news these days. Sad to hear what's happening down in the North Carolina, the Asheville, Greenville, and Charlotte area, down in South Carolina also. And when you think about here in New York, I think it was 2012, we had Superstorm Sandy, really impacted all of us, so certainly hit home with regard to what we're seeing out there down south. And we were not prepared for Superstorm Sandy. And all of a sudden, everybody started putting and implementing disaster recovery programs in addition to everything else that we had. So start thinking a little bit out of the box in terms of where we are moving. We just dealt with the whole Change Healthcare debacle in terms of the cyber attack and how many healthcare organizations were unable to do billing. Risk management in those areas is extremely important. In our IDD industry, God forbid something happened to the mill and billing systems, and in terms of how would that impact you as an organization and the ability to get payments on a regular ongoing basis. So all these things are very important. Risk happens, and we just have to make sure we are prepared to deal with this on a regular basis. And if you think about it, you implement a strategy, you look at this regularly on an ongoing basis, you'll be that much better prepared as we do move forward. So the last polling question that we do have with regard to our session is whether tone at the top is not necessary for building a strong risk culture, true or false. So importantly, as we talked about here today, if many organizations have risk management processes, they're not formalized. You do it every day because everything that you look at and everything that you are working with, there is some type of risk. You are mitigating it to some extent. Some boards are a little bit more focused on it than others. But I know certainly when I was sitting on a board, very, very important to really understand what the risks are so we can tackle them and really implement the procedures and plans so they can really be tackled with regard to what's going on. So yes, 90% of the response is false. Tone at the top is necessary with regard to building a very strong risk culture. So that is our session for today. I do really appreciate everybody coming to our Tuesdays at 10. We do have 2 more sessions, as Aaron did indicate. Christy will be back up on our stage in about a month or so. Her and I will be talking about internal audit, which is a natural follow-up to everything that we discussed here today. Like I said, Christy does internal auditing on a regular basis. That is her position here within the firm and works with many, many organizations. And I've seen the really good work that comes out of it. And sometimes you don't realize that you need to be fixed a little bit. And it's good to really look inside and really get to the answer that you do need. So, Christy, thank you very much for all the work that you put into with regard to the presentation today. And back to Aaron.
Yes, thank you, Christy. Thank you, Alan, and thanks to everyone for joining our webinar today. You will receive the presentation materials via email within the next few days. If you want to learn more or have further questions, you can reach out directly to Alan or Christy, whose contact information is in the handouts. As a reminder, we do have 2 remaining webinars in this series focused on New York IDD and behavioral health providers. Those will take place on October 15th, which will focus on New York CFR updates, and October 29th, focusing on internal audit considerations. Both of those webinars will be at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, and you can sign up for those at forvismazars.us/events. Additionally, if you're not already signed up for our Forvis Mazars foresights, you can receive notices about more webinars like this one, along with articles, white papers, and live events specific to the healthcare industry. Sign up today at forvismazars.us/subscribe. And finally, just a few CPE reminders. CPE certificates will be emailed within 2 weeks. If you have questions regarding CPE, please contact our learning and development team at cpecompliance@us.forvismazars.com. Thanks again for attending our webinar and have a great day.